it's very humbling to meet you all, and it's very nice, despite the circumstances of the world. So it's good to see that there are still people that can come together for good reasons. So thank you. I want to say hello to Elizabeth and as well as her two daughters, who are also wonderful, who are joining us as well today. And thank you to Jim Bill for helping to organize all of this, and for everyone who, obviously contributed to making this come together. So, part of what I do as a historian of Africa, right? It's interesting because language is interesting here, right? I'm not an African historian. I'm a historian of Africa. So, same thing, right? We basically study the continent and its history. So, what I prepared for you today is a little bit of like a lesson, like a teachable lesson, and things that, a topic that I think a lot of you will find genuinely interesting, related to spirituality and related to history, and a fairly well-known topic in my field, but not so well known perhaps to the broader public. And even though we're going to take you back about 500 years ago and sort of show you some images and all that, what I prepare for you is a set of slides that I'll show you some interesting facts that kind of guide this. And then as I go, I'll be manipulating the screen to show you various images that will, I think, enhance what it is that I'm saying. So in framing all of this, as I was thinking about it, I was looking over the 7 principles for the church. And I think that this particular lesson or this particular presentation really fits well with the 7th principle in particular. The quote, "Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part," end quote, right? And I was thinking about that and thinking about, various ways of approaching, what topic I might to focus on that you might find interesting, and perhaps going forward, you yourself may take it upon yourself to look into some of these topics as well. So at the end, I'm willing to stick around for as long as possible to answer any questions. I can also recommend plenty of sources. Some that are very, very straightforward, right? Not terribly academic, and other ones that are maybe not terribly, but certainly academic. So I can help thread that needle depending on your level of comfort. So what I'd like to do is share with you the screen here. Can you all see my other screen at this point? Perhaps, okay. And I want to start off with a little bit of a sense of place in terms of where we're looking in Africa, okay? So the story begins, as you can see here on your screen, in what is called West Central Africa, all right? Particularly the region of what is today the country of Angola, okay, which is down here in the southwestern part. You can see the cursor hopefully moving on the screen. And just south of what is called the Democratic Republic of the Congo, more commonly called its acronym the DRC, okay? And so what I wanted to share with you today is a little story about this place called the Kingdom of Congo. Okay, now where this is located exactly, as you can see here outlined in yellow, it was a pretty sizable kingdom in the northern part of modern day Angola that connected, of course, to the Atlantic Ocean right here. It had a very famous capital city, of which I'll talk about here in a moment, called Mbanza, Congo, that for a good part of its history became the city of Sao Salvador. And so in illustrating where this is on the map, as we zoom in a little bit closer, we're basically looking at this area here, okay? The area of northern Angola and this particular region right about there. And this is this was and remains a pretty significant city as I scroll in even further, today once again known as Mbanza, Congo, okay? So this is where the epicenter of this particular kingdom was found. So in sharing, now that we have a little bit of a sense of where we are on the continent, and where we are for the story, I want to share with you this slide presentation, okay? So I'll do this, I'll just minimize some of the images as we go. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. But let me, actually, I clicked on the wrong X. I'll bring that up here in a moment. So in thinking about this particular kingdom, we're going to take you back to a different time. Basically, our story will start in the late 1400s, right? And so I believe a lot of you are generally familiar with one of the really big dates of world history at that time. That date was 1492. Well, our story here in West Central Africa goes back even earlier than that. And so what I have prepared for you here is a series of slides to kind of navigate this. And I will go through and minimize and make some, I'll navigate it all to make sure that we can go back and forth, okay? So let's start off with the basics. So we know that this was a kingdom, okay, that was very centralized. It had a single ruler, whose name was the Mani. Okay, he was known as the Mani Congo. And throughout the history of this particular kingdom, which was around for the better part of a little over 300 years, there were at times female Mani Congos who had also come to power as well. And normally when we tend to think about kingdoms and the histories of patriarchal societies in general, obviously men tend to dominate much of those conversations. But there are, as I'll show you here today, evidence in which women played significant roles, both in the sort of politics of the kingdom, but also in the defense of this particular kingdom. The capital city, like I mentioned, was called Mbanza Congo. And if you see over here on the right side of your screen, that word Mbanza, oftentimes a lot of African languages have a root language known as Bantu, okay, B-A-N-T-U, Bantu. And when you see words taken from Bantu and spelled in English ways, oftentimes you'll notice that it looks to our eyes, right, like syllables are missing, or perhaps in this case vowels. And so the way that you would pronounce this is you would make the sound of the M and then the hard B. So Mbanza is how it would go, Mbanza Congo. The kingdom, as far as we know, right, was divided by social class and job into urban and rural districts. The city itself was fairly sizable. It was also, as you'll see here, oops, let me go back down. It was also a very powerful, what we call matrilineal kingdom. I'm going to explain that concept here to you in a moment. But basically the word line, right, you can see the line of inheritance here, came actually by way of the mothers and not necessarily by way of the fathers, which is kind of a unique sort of twist, perhaps, than what a lot of us have probably been exposed to, either when we were in school or what have you, about the way that patrilineal lines, right, father to son, and all the inheritance goes down to the male line, tended to ostracize daughters, right, tended to ostracize women in society. Well, in the Kingdom of Congo, they practiced what was called matrilineality, which I'll explain in a moment. And the date, like I said, one of the starting dates that we should mention here was the year 1483, in which a Portuguese explorer by the name of Diogo Cao, pronounced in Portuguese, it looks like Diogo Cao, right, was a lesser known Portuguese explorer compared to, say, Ferdinand Magellan or Vasco da Gama, or other very famous Portuguese explorers, was given credit for basically discovering the mouth of the Congo River, where it entered into the Atlantic Ocean, and for first interacting with local Africans there. So let me take a moment to step back and show you some of what we're talking about. So this is, I just grabbed some images off the internet, and hopefully you can see them nice and big in your screen here. This is an image that was depicted a little bit later after the Portuguese had first sort of came into contact with the Kingdom of Congo, of the capital city of Mbanza Congo. And you can see with the hustle and bustle in the front of the picture, right? You can see that this was a thriving trading city. There was a series of avenues and blocks, right? There's a sort of capital complex, right? With a palace in essence in the back of the image that you can see there. And it was a fairly sprawling city by and large. The Mani Congos, and again, to go through some of these pictures here, right? If you just simply search this on Google, you'll find many different images, sometimes depicted, by the way, by European artists who interacted over the long history of Portuguese interactions with the Congo, with these folks. And many of those Mani Congos, as we'll see here in a moment, as we talk about their cosmology, they were in fact all practicing Catholics. So the effective missionary activity in the area was quite remarkable. And I shared a couple of different images of this, but you'll notice here, this is just one example of it. Right, the way that the various Mani Congos were very decked out, and the fact that they're wearing the color yellow is also kind of an interesting note. So you may recall, or may not know this interesting fact, but this is one, that in European cultures, right, in European society, the color purple was oftentimes associated with royalty, right? It was considered something that, going back to the Caesars of Rome, was a color that was considered like, the image of power, and only that, the very wealthy leaders could wear it. Well, in parts of West Africa, the color yellow was very difficult to reproduce in clothing. And so when Portuguese traders showed up, and with them, they brought fabrics from different areas of the world, one of the things that the Mani Congos absolutely coveted was to get cloth with the color yellow that only they themselves were allowed to wear, right? Signifying their power and their status in society. And so that's why you oftentimes see many of these sort of cartoony images in various pictures here, right? With the prominence of the yellow sashes, the yellow vestments, and so on, okay? Diogo Cao, again, lesser known Portuguese explorer, kind of looks like, from what you might remember from school, right? Kind of any other, explorer of that time period, right, with the beard, sort of standing there with the stash and all that, was given credit, and this one is from an image. I'll make this a little bit bigger here, where he first came ashore, and the very romanticized image, right, of this discovery of this river outlet. And when this, of course, this is a bit of propaganda from the time period too, right, where light is shining down upon this decision, where God is wanting this to happen. But nevertheless, the picture of Diogo Cao and his crew members erecting this, an image of a crucifix and a stele right at the mouth of that particular river. Okay, so to take us back then to the Kingdom of Congo, and go back to our presentation then. So that's a little bit of the background of those factors. Now, the matrilineal line, I'm going to explain this here in a minute. I'm going to bring it up here too. Power does not go from father to son. What would happen in the Kingdom of Congo, curiously enough, is that wealth and inheritance would go from uncle to nephew. Now, this isn't something, it's almost like a diagonal line of family inheritance, right? And part of that was to give a man's, sister, or presumably, right, a degree of status in society that her son would inherit something from her brother. And so you can imagine, naturally, right, that this at times was going to provide, create the conditions for sometimes tension within families. But nevertheless, it was a way of preventing power from staying simply in the male line, and it acknowledged the role that women played in society as well, and of course promoted the production of children. All right, so a little bit of historical background. We do know that the Portuguese, by and large, still to this day as well, are Catholic. And when they introduced and they kind of established themselves with this trade and interaction with the Kingdom of Congo, missionaries then followed suit. Now, what I'd like to talk about here is one of the questions that we as historians often have wrestled with, right? And there are fairly prominent scholars that have sort of asked this question about the sort of evolution of what is called Congolese Christianity. And so I outlined this here for you in purple, as you might be able to see. That the overarching, right, the large historical question that historians have debated is this, right? Which is, did the Congolese, right, completely convert to Catholicism? Or did they alter Catholicism to complement what it is that they already believe, in creating what is called a syncretic faith tradition, right? So, most folks will come down sort of on the latter. On the end of this, right, when Catholicism showed up in a very forceful way, as I'll show you here in a moment, the Congolese had to make sense of it, right? They had to understand what it was that these missionaries were, in essence, telling them about the beliefs of Catholicism, right? About the papacy, about the history of Jesus, and so forth. And what was remarkable is that the Congolese, right, when they were interacting with missionaries, the Congolese, right, would hear about God. And they would say, well, we already, in essence, believe that there is this sort of higher power, okay? So on that one, right, the missionaries, these, Catholic missionaries were kind of like, all right, well, that's check the box. We know that we've got that. It's kind of in neutrality. And then they talked about Jesus, and they said, well, that's great. This person died for our sins. This is their belief, right? And we can understand that. That's perfectly within reason, right? Especially if that's the same. But what really worked, what especially worked from the point of view of a missionary proselytizing zeal, was the idea in Catholicism of the Holy Trinity, of God, Jesus, and especially the Holy Spirit. And it was the concept of the Holy Spirit, right, that really resonated with a lot of Congolese. And a lot of scholars have said because of that, right, many Congolese were more willing, more pliable to at least entertain the possibility of converting to Catholicism, because they started to understand it on those terms, right? So let's show you what I mean by this. So what the Congolese believed, here's the foundation. What the Congolese ultimately believed is that there was a connection between the physical world we can all see, touch, feel, hear, right, and the metaphysical world, right? The realm sort of beyond what we can see. And many faith traditions, and I'm assuming many of you know this as well, believe that there are forces that are involved, right, in some of the physical realities of our world, right? Certain groups of people believe in guardian angels. Other people, pray to certain saints, right, wishing ill will, or not ill will, but wishing positive will on people. And so what ends up happening is that people, certainly the Congolese, see a really intimate connection in this. And so there were specialists, right? There were people in Congolese society who are called Ngangas, who basically help people to mediate this. Now, when the Europeans, right, when the Portuguese were interacting with the Ngangas, they sort of derisively called them like medicine men, witch doctors. You've probably heard these sort of like, standoffish terms before, right? Diminishing their status in society. But the Ngangas were people who helped make sense of the world. So here is something, right? Perhaps you have not thought of this, but and in listening to a lot of what you were sharing during the positives, and maybe, I forget the name of the exact section, I'm sorry. But in our conversation, there were a lot of you who were very honest about what's happening in their families. So if we go back and I transplant you to the 1500s, how do you, living in a village or living in the city of Mbanza, Congo, how do you rationalize or explain something like Alzheimer's disease? How do you explain dementia? How do you explain any disease, right? And so they had to make sense of the world because certainly they were affected by many of the same things we were, but they needed explanation for why these things were happening. And oftentimes when people would suffer from disease or were getting sick, they oftentimes felt that other people in the community would sometimes wish them ill will, right? Now, in other faith traditions, right, like in Hinduism, there's the concept of karma, right, and dharma as well. Same thing in Buddhism. And so there is this sort of like explanation, right? In Christianity, right, the term for this is called theodicy, right? Like the question that a lot of people have posed, why do bad things happen to good people, right? And so we're always searching for those sorts of explanations. And the Congolese, right, we're no different from us in that regard, right? And so the Congolese believe that in order to ward off evil spirits in the community, the Nganga would help them to navigate this. Everybody had to create what was called an Nkisi, right? So everybody had a totem, everybody had something that was obviously special and sacred and spiritual to them that they felt would help and ward off evil spirits, right? And so the sum total of all of the Nkisi, the individual persons Nkisi in society, right, that metaphysical energy that was there was called the Nkisi, right? And so this is where the idea of the Holy Spirit, how this kind of intervenes, right? That there are forces beyond our vision that we cannot see in the physical world that are affecting our lives very directly. So to show you some of this, as we go back here for a moment, I wanted to show you an Nganga. So there are pictures today, right, on the internet that you can find here of people who still are acting and serve as Ngangas in Congolese society in northern Angola. And people will still go to them, and people will still search out, traditional healing methods. Sometimes they just go to them to vent their frustrations about what is happening in their lives. And the Nganga charges a small fee and provides a fair amount of comfort, okay? And they use a variety of different totems to do this and a variety of different offerings. Now, individually, right, Congolese by and large made Nkisi. Now, before you might look at this and be hopefully not frightened by them, these were very powerful symbols of Congolese spirituality. Many of them right now have been, of course, appropriated historically and have been put in Western museums. In fact, many of them, quite several of these, in fact, are on display in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and in the Brooklyn Museum down in New York City. And when you look at them, I want to show you one or two really quickly up close to kind of get the full appreciation for what it is we're talking about. So, to the untrained, to the sort of outsider looking and say, oh, this is just, bizarre behavior of what they're doing here, right? But what you'll notice about the Nkisi is that it has this opening in its chest. And in between there, you will notice that there is a cross. What is remarkable and just totally coincidental on some level about the Congolese is that they actually had this idea of a cross. It was known as the Congolese cosmogram, and it existed before the arrival of even the Catholics, believing that there's a cycle in life and believing, like any of us, right, that there's sort of a connection right to that center, right, as a lot of folks believe. And you'll notice that many of these Nkisi, right, depending on their picture, always have that sort of center of their body, right, that sort of core center of their spiritual sort of epicenter, if you will. And you'll notice that there's nails in it. Right, this one oftentimes really does capture the interest of a lot of folks. One from an artistic point of view, maybe an aesthetic point of view. But why the nails? The reason for the nails, okay, and this is just a great historical fact to share at a party sometime. Iron ore, right, just straight iron ore to make weapons, to make tools, farming implements, was extremely rare in parts of Africa historically, particularly in West Central Africa. And so when the Europeans, in this case the Portuguese, would trade with the Congolese, oftentimes ship crews would have crates of nails, right, to make repairs on the ship. And the Congolese would see the nails and sometimes trade, unfortunately, people in the form of slaves and other things to the Europeans in exchange for things like nails. And nails, right, to us, we go to Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, the hardware store, and you buy a box of nails, no big deal. But in parts of West Africa, having access to that wealth, something that was very rare, you would assign it to the spiritual energy, right? It signified to people that would see them in your household and then your neighbors would see them that you were somebody of some status who had connections. And so the Nkisi, right, and the Nganga, these were important mediaries between the metaphysical and the physical world as a whole. So let me come back to the presentation, and we'll transition to the next slide now. So am I doing okay on time, Elizabeth? Is everybody doing okay? I'm trying to keep this relatively straightforward. I don't want to go too far into a field.
I think you're doing great.
Good. I don't have much more left, I promise. I'd rather save time for questions. So there's a lot here. There's a lot packed in, and I will happily share these slides with you all if you want to read them all in greater detail later. But we do know that the Portuguese showed up, yes, but so too did Italian Capuchin missionaries, made famous by the fact that I can't do this because I'm old, right? But made famous by the fact that what oftentimes these Capuchin Catholic monks would do is if they had a full head of hair, they would shave their head in such a way that made their hair look like they had a halo, kind of like if you've seen Capuchin monkeys who have that very noticeable circle on their head, okay? And so many of them showed up, and as these Italian Capuchin missionaries and Portuguese traders were there, the first Catholic church, the oldest Catholic church in Africa, as far as we can tell, that is still standing, was built in 1491, which is pretty remarkable in this part of northern Angola, which again, knowing some history and dates, right? 1492, Columbus hadn't even gotten on the boats yet, okay? And already there's a Catholic church here in West Africa. So the Italian Capuchins come in, and because these are missionaries and they're there trying to like mediate these beliefs of the Congolese, sometimes the Capuchins would undermine the power of the Nganga, right? Because now there was in essence a rival spiritualist, somebody who knew about why bad things were happening, right? The Capuchins would chalk this up to the devil, but Ngangas would sometimes chalk this up to ancestors of other people wishing you ill will because of rivalries and jealousy. But either way, there were these competing cosmologies that emerged within the kingdom itself. We do know that Congolese crucifixes, as Catholicism did start to make these inroads, oftentimes depicted Jesus as black. So there, I'll show you evidence of that in a moment. And another remarkable fact that normally when it comes to the sacrament of baptism in most Christianity, many people are generally accustomed to the idea of the use of water, right? So water washing away the sins symbolically. Well, in parts of West Africa, water actually was obviously necessary for life and sustaining ourselves, but it also formed the boundaries by which certain communities expand and contract. In other words, if you've passed over a river or stream, all of us have in a car at another point, oftentimes African communities would sort of isolate from each other when they would reach a water barrier, right? So on one side of the stream, right, African community X would have access to this water, and on the other side of the stream, African community Y would have access to this water. But nevertheless, they would not cross the water. And the reason for that was that if they crossed beyond, and this is unique to the Congolese in particular, if they crossed beyond these riverine boundaries, they believed that they left their sort of like spiritual energy and that their souls, in fact, could be very easily victimized by neighbors. Now, as a result of that, a lot of you can understand that for many Africans of the interior who believed that water should form boundaries, there was a lot of superstition around water. And so when Africans, very sadly, in this part of Africa were rounded up and sold into slavery, and for the first time, many Africans from the interior brought to the coastline and had seen the ocean, one of the horrifying many tragedies of the Atlantic slave trade was that many of them, upon seeing the ocean for the very first time with their own eyes, thought they were going on their way to die. And they could not have been, unfortunately, more correct about that. But nevertheless, water, because of superstition involved in this, the Capuchin missionaries were then allowed, believe it or not, by the Catholic Church. When people convert to Catholicism in this kingdom, they were allowed to use salt on their tongues. Salt had real power, it had real value in society, and the Catholic Church, for over 400 years at this point, right, still in parts of Angola, allow for the use of salt as a form of baptism in the Catholic Church in this part of Africa. All right, so let's show you some of those pictures, and we'll go from there. So let's go to this. So some of you might remember, I don't know if you do, I'll get this in a second. The other alternative presentation I was going to make is on this movie that came out about 2 years ago called Black Panther. Now, even if you've never seen the movie, right? It's Hollywood, it's very romanticized and so forth. But there's a lot of really interesting things about the film. And just for a quick one little point I want to make, there's a very powerful scene in this movie. You could see that here, right? Just in the sort of Google image searches, in which this Black Panther basically travels from the physical world to the metaphysical world to meet his father. And the way that the directors sort of like, cast the imagery, right, with this very beautiful lighting and so forth. As Africanists, when, scholars like myself would go see this film, we were looking for all of these little cues, these little things that they inserted into the film very cleverly, that resonate with a lot of African practices and cultural traditions. And so I'm not going to go too far afield in that, but I wanted to let you know that if you ever do see that movie, grandkids or kids or whatever, and you're watching that film, there is that connection that they do make even in this movie between the physical and metaphysical realms. Okay. All right. So let me share with you then a few other pictures, and then we'll begin the beginning of our end of our presentation. So this is the Cathedral of the Holy Savior of Congo. It is the oldest church, as far as Catholic church in West Africa. Obviously, today it is a ruin. It's been around for over the better part of 500 years, as you can see here. And it is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, given the fact that despite its religious connotation there, it is so old, right? And they don't, practice Mass in there, but it is a pretty significant tourist attraction, in fact, in this part of Northern Africa. Okay. The most powerful Mani Congo, who actually converted to Catholicism, I'll just show you some pictures here, was this guy right here, who in the year 1509, okay, was already writing letters to both the King of Portugal and to the Pope. The Vatican City Archives actually has records of some of these letters in which this particular king of the Congo not only converted, and you can see he's wearing a lot of yellow, right? Not only converted, but he was asking the Pope in some of those letters to establish a bishopric, right? To basically have a representative from the Kingdom of Congo sent to the Vatican to represent the kingdom. This was in 1509. Okay, this is how long ago, of course, that happened. So that's Afonso, right? There's the cathedral again, and perhaps the big sort of like most fascinating element of this is how, after 250 years of these interactions, the Congolese and of course the Europeans who are with them, oftentimes were depicting images, right, of what was happening between the Italian Capuchin missionaries and the Congolese people. In this case, a pretty violent image, unfortunately, where a Capuchin missionary is igniting the house of a rival Nganga. And you could see that there's various charms and images and snakes on the ground, right? And how the Africans, of course, the other Congolese are watching this. But in other cases, right, the sort of rivalry of the power, right, with the Italian Capuchin missionaries sort of sitting there, where the Mani Congo is bowing them before them, and you can clearly see a church in the background with a crucifix and so on. The pictures, all of these images, by the way, I should mention this, were drawn in the 18th century, in the 1700s, well after the Congolese had already become Catholic by and large. But nevertheless, they are a very powerful set of images. And again, I will provide you at the end of this, if you are curious, with sources and links to check this all out. Even if you can't read the 18th century Italian on the bottom there, the images are very, very potent, right? In this case, you can see that there's sort of this equal balance, right? We have umbrellas on both sides, which symbolize power. You have congregants on both sides, and the Mani Congo festooned in sort of this yellow garb, but behind him, how his military, right, engaging with this one missionary, how his military has guns and cannons, right? Something that we don't normally think about in these transactions between, powerful different entities.
Michael, is it possible to make the image a little bigger?
Yeah, probably. Yes, probably. See, here's the thing: Pinterest wants you to buy the picture, so they always have the pictures, but there is much to buy. But yes, I can certainly search and make it a little bit bigger. It might be a little bit smaller on the screen here. I apologize.
No, don't do Pinterest.
Yeah, yes, of course, right. Some of them I know for a fact. Let's see if I can make them any bigger here. I'm just clicking on because there's so many. I didn't want to have a slide of just all of them. But here's just a good example. Hopefully, this is a little bit bigger and see this. Of an interaction between the Mani Congo and the local Capuchin missionary, right, whose haircut you can clearly see here looks like a halo. So it's probably because Zoom and just the nature of this. But if you can sort of make these out, and again, I'll provide plenty of links, they're quite fascinating. A lot of them really do show the sort of interactions between these two groups. But a lot of historians would basically say is mutual terms. Okay. All right. So in rounding out the presentation, I want to make sure I give get it could get to the end of what my point here is, and welcome to time for questions. We know that one of the tragedies of this interaction between the people was, in fact, that the slave trade began to really have an impact. Despite the fact that people are there actively, doing God's work and believing in, these sort of blending between Congolese cosmology and Catholicism, we do know that sadly the slave trade became a very big part of that. So much so, one of the most remarkable documents of this time period, I'm just going to go to it here real fast for you, of this time period was the fact that we have a letter. This letter right here translated into English. It might be a little bit small on your screen. Again, I'll happily share these links. In which the Manicongo, Alfonso I, right, this very prominent Catholic Manicongo who asked for the bishopric, wrote a letter to the King of Portugal, basically asking him to please intervene to stop the fact that these merchants, and here's the point, are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, our noblemen, vassals, and relatives, ease of all of this stuff, and are grabbing them, in essence, selling them into slavery. So here we are in 1506, right, where the benevolence between both groups is sort of, we're going to meet you halfway. We're now, unfortunately, descending into the violence that began to engulf the place. So the last two things I want to mention in the essence of time is this. The Kingdom of Congo also had folks, women in particular, that came later in history to dominate and influence politics in the surrounding environment. This is Queen Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba. And she became, she was Catholic, and she became kind of by default one of the leaders of the Congo, even though she was the queen of two other neighboring kingdoms, simply as the place was beginning to disintegrate as a result from slavery. There's an image here, again, a little bit small to make out, but you'll see her actually sitting on the back of one of her servants, quite remarkably, acting as a diplomat with some of the, in this case, Portuguese traders that were doing business, and she was trying to negotiate the end of the slave trade, right, of which they ignored her. And just to show you the depths at which Catholicism made some inroads here, later in the 1700s, another young girl who was born in 17, I have to do the math, she was born in 1786, if my memory serves me correct, 1784 perhaps. When she was a teenager, she went to bed one night and believed that God came down and actually spoke to her and told her that she was the literal embodiment of the patron Saint Anthony. She came out of this dream. She told people this. People believed it. She apparently performed, according to the witnesses, right, some degree of miracles. She took over the Congolese military at the age of 17 and led them into battle against the Portuguese. It's a remarkable story. Her name right here was Dona Beatriz Quimpavita. And this story, right, of her life shows you, one, the influence both of Catholicism and, of course, belief, and the way that the metaphysical embodiment, right, that here we have a female teenager, who was told by God and in the belief of Congolese Christians that she was the embodiment of St. Anthony. Now, eventually, she was captured by the Portuguese. She was tried for being a witch and burned at the stake. And I'm guessing for a lot of you, this sounds very familiar. You might be like, hey, that sounds like another historical woman who had these similar visions named Joan of Arc, right? So sometimes Dona Beatriz Quimpavita is known as the Congolese Joan of Arc, okay? It's pretty remarkable. So in concluding my remarks for today, like I said, I have just a couple of final thoughts, and I'm certainly welcome to your questions later, as I mentioned. And I'm happy to share all of these. These other notes here that I prepared for you basically illustrate what we were just saying about the women in Njinga of Mbemba, Dona Beatriz Quimpavita, but ultimately how we can see the Congolese as Catholics. When they arrived in the Americas, oftentimes they took that faith with them. And out of that, we see new religions emerge in Brazil, a religion called Candomblé. We see religions in the Caribbean, much like Santeria, and variations on the religion called Voodoo, that most Westerners call Voodoo. There's a lot of Christian influences and a lot of these slaves, the origin of those faith systems, syncretic faiths in the Americas. So all in all, here's what we can say is by way of conclusion. The Congolese were not hapless victims, right? Congolese Christianity was a syncretic religion where they basically chose what aspects of Catholicism they liked and basically tweaked it to meet their needs. The process of conversion did certainly take centuries, and many Congolese still worship this way today, I should say. And in looking at the last little point here, here's a great illustration, a nice way to end this, of a Congolese cross made of solid iron, right? Because iron was real value, it had real money. The Catholic Church not only allowing crosses to be made of iron, but also allowing the Congolese to depict images of Jesus as a black man. Quite remarkable stuff, and found, of course, in museums. So I wanted to thank you. I know our time is short here. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm welcome for questions, and thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something new. Okay, that's always the goal.